Let's be real, Hyrox is an endurance sport. Your engine matters more than anything else. But if you look at the top athletes in the sport, they're not just cardiovascularly fit, they're also very powerful. And that is because some stations demand more force per muscle contraction than others. And if you cannot generate that force or that power as an athlete, your race pace eventually will die off. So in this video, I will give you some new perspective on the physiology and the biomechanics of the different functional stations. And I will show you how each station demands different training methods to be able to dominate them. And at the end of the video, I will reveal a secret science-backed method that not that many people know about, and it can actually help you to improve your power training in Hyrox. I will also give you some real-world examples that you can actually implement right away in your training. Super excited for this one, so without further ado, let's go straight into it. Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Gomar. I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich, based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so, I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology. And my goal now is to bring some of that science that I learned back to you guys. So if you have been following this channel for some time, you know that I like to look at things from first principles. If we want to understand how to train for a certain sport, we first have to understand really deeply the demands of that sport. So I made a table that structures all the different movements in Hyrox, going from the run interspersed with all the different functional movements, and importantly, how many muscular contractions you are typically doing in that specific station. So let's dig into it. I mean, it's probably not a good idea to show a table, a big table in the beginning of the video. I mean, the big YouTubers would certainly advise against that, but we're here for the science, so we don't care. First of all, the run, right? So obviously you have to do it 8 times the run, so it's a very important, integral even part of Hyrox. And if you think about it, usually when you're running at a 4 minutes per K pace, so that's a fast pace, I would say, you're doing approximately 160 contractions with both legs, so that's 80 contractions per minute during that run per minute. Then you have the ski erg. You have maybe seen this also on your screens. You're looking at approximately 25 strokes per minute. So 25 contractions, mostly of the lats and of the upper back per minute. Then you can see the sled push. That's where the interesting part is, in my opinion, because it takes for most people 4 to 5 minutes to advance the sleds 50 meters, sled pull and sled push. And if you calculate that, that only equates to 8 to 9 contractions, again, per leg, certainly for the sled push, per minute. So that's a way lower amount of contractions compared to, for example, the run and the ski erg. Also, the burpee broad jumps, it is 11.4 according to my assumptions and my calculations per minute. So again, substantially lower compared to, for example, the run and also the ski erg. And then you can read along. The row obviously is going to be very close to the same as a ski erg. The farmer's carry, that's an interesting one. It's basically walking, so it's going to be around 45 to 50 contractions per minute. This is looking at the contractions of the lower leg. Obviously, it's an isometric contraction when you keep the kettlebells in a firm isometric contraction during the walk, but that's something else. Then the lunges is going to be very similar to the burpee broad jump, 12.5 contractions per minute. And then the wall ball, if you take 5 minutes to do 100 wall balls, obviously it's going to be 20 contractions. Then I made some assumptions to do that, like the running speed and how long every station takes. That's obviously important for how many contractions you do. You can read them in the middle column. It can be a bit slower, it can be a bit faster, but these are kind of medium average paces. Then the external weight, that's important because that also heavily relates to the force you need per contraction. And obviously the run, there's no external weight. Doesn't mean that it's just the body weight. You still have to accelerate the body weight, but the external weight is pretty low, is obviously a more endurance type, cardiovascular type of movement. Then the ski erg as well as the row is the external weight of the flywheel. So it's not only your body weight, there's also some external weight, obviously quite limited related to other movements. Then the sled push and the sled pull are going to be very high in external weight. I mean, for the pro weights, for the boys, it's going to be 202 kilograms. So we're talking about very high external weights and very low amount of contractions per minute. That's the key part here. Then the burpee broad jumps, an interesting one. There's no external weight, but if you would measure the force produced on a force plate, for example, when you jump, like take off from a burpee to the jump, it's actually pretty high. So the contraction and certainly the velocity of contraction is pretty high. I will get to that in the next column. Then we have the farmer's carry. There is external weight, but obviously that's mostly related to the grip strength, not towards your quadriceps, for example, or your calves. And then the lunges, there is a medium as well as the wall balls, medium external weight, but pretty low amount of contractions per minute. So if you would equate that to, I would call this force per contraction. So how much force actually the muscle has to produce for that contraction. And we're looking at very low during the run, obviously, because you're doing a continuous movement and it's more of a cardiovascular type of movement. Then we have the ski erg and the row, as well as the farmer's carry. That's rather in the low category. There is obviously some contractions. I'm talking mostly about the lower body here, but these are not super forceful, high power contractions. I think you can relate to that if you ever have done a Hyrox race, which I do recommend doing once because it's a fun challenge, I would say. Then the very high category where you have a lot of force but low amount of contractions are obviously the sled push as well as the sled pull. And then you have this medium to high category. I would call them the burpee broad jumps. It's maybe most people would forget that, but there is actually quite a lot of force generation, as I just said, in the burpee broad jumps, and also the lunges, certainly because they have to be unbroken, and the wall balls certainly also because your muscles are already fatigued, so your RPE will be much higher. So this is something I think you can picture in your mind what is kind of necessary per station, including the run and all the functional stations. And I also made a little graph to make it a little bit more visually appealing, I think, where the color scheme remains the same, and I just plotted a whole Hyrox race through time. So the runs are going to be low, and then you see an exponentially higher, let's say, force per contraction in the sled pull and the sled push, and also the burpee broad jumps, lunges, and wall balls. So that's very important to understand that, yes, it is a cardiovascularly demanding sport, but you have 3 to 4 minutes within that 1 hour 15, where there is very high force as well as power production. I will get to that now. Because if you look at basic physics and basic biomechanics, I would say, we know that there is a relationship between the amount of reps you can do and the percentage of your 1RM, of your 1RM max. To make it simple, if you do 1 rep at the maximal weight that you can push or pull. For example, you do a back squat and you can do 310 kilograms, but not 305, right? That's your 1RM. And this will be on the left side of the curve. Obviously, the percentage of 1RM is 100, and your reps that you can do is only 1. And then it goes exponentially, or in the beginning linearly, and then exponentially down. With the more reps you do, the lower percentage of your 1RM, right? If you have ever followed a strength training protocol, you have certainly seen do now 5 reps at whatever, 75% of your 1RM. Obviously, because there is a relationship to that. This is just an average. Some people can do more reps at a higher percentage of their 1RM, and some people can do way less. For example, I can do very little amount of reps at a high percentage of my 1RM, for example. So, and then you can also think about, okay, where are the functional movements here plotted in this graph? And all the way at the right bottom side is obviously the running. You do a lot of repetitions at a very low percentage of your 1RM, of your maximal muscle contraction, for example, of the quadriceps. But then you go to the sleds, or also the burpee broad jumps. We're looking at high percentage of your 1RM and very low amount of reps. For example, here, 8 reps per leg per minute for the sleds, right? So that's an important consideration also, again, to understand how we have to also train for those different movements. Because if you look at, again, last part of biomechanics, a very famous and well-known graph and say relationship in biomechanics is the force velocity curve. When the velocity is 0 or very low, your force can be very high. For example, I'm doing an isometric or almost isometric bicep curl, very heavy dumbbell. I can just move it up. My velocity is very low, but my force or the percentage of 1 RM is very high. And then when I, for example, do a sprint, a 100-meter sprint, my force will be pretty low, but my speed will be super high. And then there's a third variable, and that is the power. And what is known also from basic biomechanics is that you can generate the most amount of power, the most amount of watts, joule per second, when you are moving moderate weight at a moderate speed. Good? So that is important to understand, because if you want to move the sled, you need specifically force. You need to be high up at the high percentages of your 1 RM. Right? Not specifically power. You also need power, obviously, but you specifically need force, because otherwise you cannot even move the sled. But on the other hand, the rather medium to high force per contraction movements, for example, burpee broad jumps, for example, the lunges, for example, the wall balls, you specifically need a lot of power, right? Medium weights at a higher contraction speed, as well as less reps per minute, so to speak. Good. So having that background, the question remains, how do you train for that? So first of all, force, like high force production, for example, mostly the sleds, I would say, the sled push and the sled pull. There we're looking at specific strength training. That will be not in the scope of this video. You need to increase your 1 RM and your high percentages of your 1 RM back squat, lunges, front squat, and sled push, and so on. Right? I actually made a video on how to improve your strength for CrossFit and also for functional sports that I will let you popping up right now, and also I will refer to this in the end of the video. If you're interested, you can also look at that one. But what I want to talk about in this video is how to specifically train your power using functional movements related to Hyrox. To improve your power, you certainly don't always have to go super heavy at low contraction speed. That is not going to improve your power, it's rather going to improve your strength. If you want to improve your power, as I already referred to on beforehand, you need to have pretty high velocity or high contraction speed at medium weights. And I call this kind of power training or sprint interval training. I think it's actually a better name. What you, for example, can do that would relate to sprint interval training for Hyrox, you do 5 rounds for time. Full recovery, I will get to that in a second, where you do 13 to 9 cals on the air bike all out. So you go super hard on a certain machine. Then you go straight into 10 wall balls, so not that many, 10 wall balls at medium weight, so fast contraction speed. And then you do 12 plyo jumps or plyo lunges, where you jump off, where you really make sure that you take off from the floor to have even a faster contraction speed. That takes, if you are, let's say, an RX athlete and you know how to move, takes approximately 1 minute, and then you have almost full recovery by doing a 3-minute rest. All right, so you do a sprint and then you rest sufficiently. I see a lot of people and a lot of training plans doing similar training, but they don't give enough recovery. So this means that you are relying more on the aerobic system if you reduce the recovery time compared to the anaerobic glycolytic fast high power production systems. So when you do this type of training, this is just one of the examples, make sure that you rest enough. Another example would be related to sleds. Every 6 minutes for 5 rounds. So you have always every 6 minutes you start again your exercises. You do a medium weight but fast contraction 12.5 meter sled push at a whatever 100 kilos or 110 kilos for a RX male and 70 kilos for a woman. Then you do 12 heavy Russian kettlebell swings and a 50-meter sprint, like a fast sprint using just your body weight. And then again, you rest probably around 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes. It depends on how fast you can do this. So you are fully recovered and you repeat that 4 or 5 times. You can obviously linearly progress the volume throughout time. This is one of the training methods that we do in our programming, because, you know, writing Hyrox or CrossFit workouts, just writing them randomly, that's not difficult. right? You can always find something or come up with something that is interesting. What is the hard part, specifically in CrossFit and also in Hyrox to a lesser extent, is how can I structure them that I have progressive overload without over fatiguing the athlete. And that is really where we try to put all our focus on, is to create fun programs for sure, but also with sufficient undulating hard days, medium days, and easy days, or even zone 2 days. If you're interested in trying out one of our Hyrox specific or CrossFit functional fitness specific training plans, just scan the QR code that is popping up right now. You are supporting the page with that because you know we don't take any external sponsors, and you get fit along the way, so it's a win-win for everyone. Just check it out. There's also a link in the description. Cool. I also said in the intro, I don't want to let you down for this one, that there is some kind of a bonus, a secret formula to improve even or to boost even your power training related to Hyrox. And here we have to talk about PAPE or PAPE. It's a bit of a funny name. No, it's not Pope, it's actually PAPE. And what does it say, or what does it mean? It is a scientific term for post-activation performance enhancement. And basically what it means is that scientists have figured out that if you do something very heavy, even an isometric contraction, or for example, a heavy back squat, a heavy, like a 1RM, 2RM front squat, or a heavy sled push, and you do that without over fatiguing yourself or the athlete, right? So you do a couple of reps, not that many, and then you rest for 7-8 minutes, like full rest, again, to not over fatigue the athlete. And then you do a medium high power movement, for example, sprinting, or a sled push that is a bit longer but lower weight. Then you can actually generate more power doing this. Just look at the little diagram here. For example, an athlete does a counter movement jump. He wants to jump as high as possible from the floor. Okay, for example, jumps 30 centimeter high. Then he would do this pre-activity or this PAPE, where he does a heavy back squat, 3 times 1 heavy back squat at 90% of his 1RM. And then he rests 8 minutes, 7-8 minutes. Then what is shown in many papers already before, I mean, I'm not the first one who talks about this, but maybe related to Hyrox, I might be. You rest 7-8 minutes, and then your twitch or your muscle activation is actually higher. So you're able to jump higher. Instead of 30 centimeters, you can jump 35 centimeters high. And that's quite interesting because it is related to, first of all, they thought, okay, it's only related to your central nervous system. You're able to recruit more motor units. I think that's still one of the most important, let's say, mechanisms of this PAPE or this activation potential. But you can also, for example, or some data has shown that you are better able to coordinate your different muscles, meaning your agonists. You're better able to coordinate the actual jump performance after such a back squat. And then there's also other things related to warm-up. If you do those kind of heavy muscle contractions, you're able to increase the muscle temperature, increase the different fluids and enzymes, or the activation of the enzymes in your muscle, and hence it will potentiate the effect of your power training, I would say. So how can you implement this as a last part into your Hyrox training? Because I think it's quite interesting, and at least in our Hyrox plans, we haven't implemented yet, but we will, after some consideration, also implement it, certainly for our speed and power athletes for Hyrox training. What you can do, for example, again, this is an example that you can take home, and obviously you can change it. You do a general warm-up to have cardiovascular warm-up. You do an erg session for 5 minutes. Then you do some functional movements at light weight, and then you do some ballistic stretching. Then you go straight into this PAPE, which is, for example, a 10-meter sled push, pretty heavy. All right, so you do whatever, you stack up the weights and you do a couple of muscle contractions, 5 to 10 meters, and then you rest. And you do that 3 times, 4 times, without over fatiguing yourself. This is not a training, it's an activation, important to know. And you can also do seated med ball throws if you want to potentiate the upper body, because that's something that I forgot to say. If your later training or your power training is related to the lower body, obviously do the PAPE in the lower body. If you're training the upper body or you want to improve the power of your upper body, for example, for the burpee broad jumps, then do rather activation of the upper body. For example, you take a heavy med ball and you throw it 5 times explosively to the wall. That's also a good idea. Then importantly, you rest long. You walk around a bit, you sit down like the weightlifters, and you do literally nothing. And then you do your sprint interval training, as I just explained. You should be able to be more powerful in this case, and where you're more powerful and you can actually generate more reps in a certain time, so you can do more training volume. That will also improve your overall training effect. All right. So the PAPE can improve how you can train those sprint intervals that I spoke about a couple of minutes ago in this video. Good. All right, that was already it. I wanted to give you also a little take-home message if you want to skip all the way to the end of the video. Some people do that, and I want to make sure that you get everything. So sleds, specifically sleds, burpee broad jumps, lunges, and wall balls, we can consider as high force per muscle contraction. And yeah, you also have to train kind of specifically for those because yeah, they need more force per muscle contraction. We're looking at force specifically for sleds and for the different sleds pull and sled push, and rather power production, so medium weight, higher speed at the burpee broad jumps for sure, the lunges as well as the wall balls to get out of the hole, out of the bottom of the squat really quick. The best way to train this is to have a specific day. That's important, I forgot to say again. That includes your sprint interval training that I just explained, where you do high powerful movements for 1 minute, 50 seconds approximately, and then you rest a very long time. That's important that you rest a long time. Importantly, again, this, even though it's very low volume of training, your actual training is going to be very low, but your fatigue or the recovery after that training needs to be pretty long. So I would never, or at least I would avoid certainly in the beginning, to add too much training volume after this. Basically, you go into a gym, you do your warm-up, you do your activation, your PAPE, and then you rest for a couple of minutes, and then you do one session, like one super powerful session where you go all out, and then literally you do maybe a little cool down. And after 45 minutes, you go home, you rest, you eat your proteins and so on. Don't do any zone 2 training or heavy back squats afterwards. I think it will just over fatigue you and it's probably not a good idea. Again, if you're working in zone 5 or zone 6, like very high power production, you need a lot of rest after that. And then, as I said, the PAPE or the post-activation performance enhancement can be used to improve your training stimulus on those sprint intervals. And then the better the training stimulus is, the better or the higher the intensity, the more effects you're gonna have. That's also part of the CrossFit methodology. Cool, that was it for my part today. If you like this kind of content, if you find some value out of this, share it with friends, subscribe to the channel, and better, watch some of the videos that I made before on this topic. Have a good one and see you in the next one.